Last we left off, the crushing defeat of the Phocians at the Battle of Neon had but stopped the Phokian revolt in its tracks. The Boeotian commander Pamenes had won the greatest victory of his career. However, it would seem that he would not follow up this victory with the siege on Delphi. Rather, he and the Amphictyonic forces returned home. Such a move seems bizarre, to leave on the cusp of complete victory instead of ending the sacred war then and there. Our explanation comes to us not from Greece, but rather abroad, in the satrapy of Phrygia. Artabazus II, the local satrap, was always loyal to Artaxerxes II, although he did not show the same loyalty to Artaxerxes' son and successor, Artaxerxes III, for when he sought to reduce the power of the Anatolian satrapies by demanding they disband their armies, he had sparked the Great Satrap Revolt in 356. At first hiring the Athenian general Hares, he had to back down after threats from the King of Kings to intervene in the social war. Thus, short a general, he sought to employ one from Athens' rival. Thebes had no real reason to reject the offer. Any real retaliation from the Persians would result in a pan-Hellenistic coalition against them, not unlike the Persian wars of the 5th century. With this in mind, following up the Battle of Neon with a costly siege on Delphi versus a much more profitable venture in Asia made sense. The Phokians seemed defeated and robbed of their gains. It would not be ridiculous for the Thebans to assume that they would surrender before the next campaigning season in the spring of 355. And so, the Thebans sent 5,000 of their troops under Pamenes to Phrygia, although there is no confusing the tactical mistake of not pursuing the Phokians to Delphi and bringing an end to the war. With the shattered remnants from Neon, Onomarchus, the second-in-command to Philomelos, returned to Delphi. Beaten but not defeated, he once again went about rallying the Phocians to continue to resist. However, the enthusiasm for Philomelos had diminished after Neon. The parties leaning towards peace became a more vocal minority. Onomarchus, as strategos, had invited the prominent members of the Confederacy and delegates from allies in Athens and Sparta to help push towards continuing the war effort. The decision on continuing the war or making peace wasn't as simple as it may seem. Peace would put them at the mercy of the Amphictyoni, and if the Amphictyoni had already demanded 1,000 talents before the war, then having seized Delphi, plundered her treasuries, and defied them in battle would surely result in devastating reparations. No worming could shift the blame onto just Philomelos and Onomarchus, as they were duly elected magistrates of the Confederacy chosen for their course of action. The curse of the Amphictyoni befell on not just the leaders, but all the people of Phocis. War then would mean that they would have to rebuild and rearm only by plundering the treasuries even more extensively than they already had. It would be double or nothing. Their fate then was in a man who could act on his own, but whose consequences would be theirs. To this effect, Onomarchus was made to succeed Philomelos as strategos autocrator, and his brother Phaelos as strategos. Not that they had much choice, as beyond his oratory skills and prestigious family connections, it was the loyalty of his mercenaries that had secured his position, and to this he sought to quell any dissidents. Acting within his right as strategos autocrator, he tried and executed his political enemies and confiscated their property, although such actions were no different than that of a tyrant. Step 2 in his plan was to rebuild the Phokian forces, and accordingly he exceeded past any damage done by Philomelos in his plundering of the Delphic treasury. Aside from the obvious gold and silver dedications being smelted down for coins, any and all bronze and iron were reused into raw materials for the war effort. He could legitimize this, as just as he inherited the role as the leader of the Phocians from Philomelos, so too could he claim to inherit the oracle from Apollo and the freedom that it entailed. Knowing that Philomelos' failed exploits likely would have burned his allies from lending troops, Onomarchus set about raising another mercenary army, but this time much larger than before. Totaling at about 20,000 infantry and 500 cavalry, this army dwarfed any of that in Greece at this time. And here we see the distinct difference the Sacred War had in comparison to any other war of classical Greece. By all rights, a defeat such as that at Neon would cause any other polis to capitulate and admit defeat. But whilst the Phokians had the huge wealth of the treasury at Delphi and the conviction to continue to raid it, war would not end until ultimate victory or complete defeat. Time was on Onomarchus' side, free at the winter of 354 until the next campaigning season. His strategic position had been slightly improved from Philomelos' work, and he set about trying to capitalize on these gains. The shattering defeat of the Western Locrians early on in the war largely knocked them out of the war, and Onomarchus sought to cement this fact by coercing them into an alliance with Phocas. The city of Amphissa was garrisoned, securing his western flank. Also, further establishing his legitimacy over Delphi, he allowed these Locrians to consult the oracle freely. By the start of the campaigning season in the spring of 354, Onomarchus, with his newly raised mercenary army, attacked the eastern Locrians. This time, striking from the south, with the target being the city of Thernion. Capturing Thernion would be crucial to his plans as it would effectively block off the pass of Thermopylae to the Amphidyoni. The siege also gave Onomarchus the opportunity to try out his new non-torsion catapults, a newcomer to the still primitive siegecrafts of ancient Greece. With little hope from the other cities of eastern Locris that were still exhausted from Philomelos' campaign, the Threnians surrendered to Onomarchus after a short siege. Onomarchus enslaved the populace and placed a garrison in the city. Victory here threw the Locrians on the defensive and more or less out of the war. Next, he turned his head to the northwest to Tetrapolis of Doris. They had largely been inactive in the war, but they had thrown their weight behind the Amphidyoni, meaning they had to be under Phokian control. Onomarchus went about plundering their cities and the countryside, stopping another front before it started, and likely garrisoned their cities. Furthermore, he gave them the right to consult the oracle. It would seem then that the Phokians' new Amphidyoni had more members and gathering legitimacy than the one they were fighting against. The northern front then seemed to be secured, all except for Thessaly. However, they were in less than any shape to fight the Phocians once more, for after their bout with Philomelos outside of Argolis, the defeat dealt a significant blow to the League's power. Factionalism then reared its ugly head as it always did in Thessaly, with tyrants once again rising up in foray. The men of the hour this time were Lycophron and Philomelos, succeeding Alexander to once again attempt to annex Thessaly. Onomarchus, invested in his enemies remaining divided, supported the tyrants, cementing an alliance with them and contributing substantial sums to the creation of their own mercenary army. Standing up to the threat of foray were the Elude family of Larissa, yet they had suffered a large number of casualties from the Phokians already, weakening their ability to fight back. In their time of need, they appealed to the only ally who could help them, Philip II of Macedon. Last we left off, Philip was in the middle of his war against the Athenians over the strategic polis of Amphipolis. Allying with the Chalcidians, Philip had all but secured the Thracian coast and cast off the cities that remained allied to Athens. By 355, Methone stood last in his campaign, remaining under a siege which had cost him an eye. Finally, by the summer of 354, the city had surrendered and the Macedonian coastline was his. The fate of the city, which had cost him an eye and prolonged for so long, seemed to end rather mercifully. The city walls were demolished and the inhabitants were spared from slavery, instead offered exile with the clothes on their back. This relatively lenient treatment seems bizarre given the cost of the siege, but the delegates of Larissa seemed to offer an explanation. The call to arms from his southern neighbour presented an opportunity to Philip that he could hardly ignore. His previous intervention in 357 to stop the tyrant Alexander II of Foray likely ended in a diplomatic solution than in any real conquest. However, the existential threat that Lycophron and Philomelos presented to the Thessalian League required a more heavy-handed approach. A decisive victory now could once and for all secure his southern border and bring Thessaly under his dominion. To jump onto this opportunity as quickly as he could, he gave the citizens of Methone such benevolent terms. In the late summer of 354, Philip led his army, this time with adequate siege machinery, to Thessaly, ready to bring down the walls of Pherae. He moved first to Larissa to rendezvous with the forces and march onwards onto Pherae. The tyrants, hearing of Philip's march towards them, fled back to Pherae with a plan to hold out and await reinforcements from the Phokians. Onomarchus' success in Locris and Doris secured himself from attacks in all directions and left only the Boeotians to stand against him. He pushed southwards down the Kephisos Valley to the city of Orchomenos. Orchomenos at this point was largely in ruins. Once a prominent polis of the Boeotian League, it suffered devastation from Thebes for its attempt to overthrow the League in 364. It was reduced mostly to scattered villages along the countryside and rendered powerless. With such enmity against the Thebans, Onomarchus was welcomed as a liberator, hoping he would bring an end to Theban oppression. The capture of Orchomenos secured the northern route around Lake Copaeus from Theban attacks. After garrisoning Orchomenos, he then proceeded to besiege Chaeronea, an important city tactically for control over the sudden entrance to the Kephisos Valley, and would bring all of northwestern Boeotia under Phokian control. Victory here meant defeat for the Boeotians in the war. Here then is when he would have received reports from the tyrants of Pherae of Philip's entrance to Thessaly. Not wanting to have his plans foiled and his northern flank exposed, Onomarchus sent his right-hand man and brother, Philomelos, with 7,000 men to reinforce the tyrants in Thessaly. At this point, Pherae was well under siege by Philip, and when news arrived to him that a Phokian relief force was coming, he knew he had to stop them before they joined up with the tyrants. So, under the cover of darkness, while firing up the smithies, as to make it seem like they were building more siege machinery, he, in actuality, decided to dismantle them and lifted the siege. This surprise stopped the tyrants from getting a message to Philomelos before Philip faced them in the field and expelled them out of Thessaly. Meanwhile at Chaeronea, Onomarchus, now short 7,000 men, continued to besiege the city. However, hearing news of Philomelos' dispatchment, the Boeotians were emboldened to repulse Onomarchus, even though they were short 5,000 men themselves and outnumbered. The mixture of a sally and the relief force managed to drive Onomarchus from the city, but the defeat was nothing significant. The defeat in Thessaly and Chaeronea made Onomarchus realize that he could not sustain a two-front offensive. The Boeotians had run him from Chaeronea, but they did not have the capabilities to launch an offensive into Phocis, while Pamides and his men were still away. Philip then would have to be his main concern, and his gamble to win the war would hinge on victory and subduing Thessaly. Onomarchus marched into Thessaly in full force, with the remnants of Philomelos' detachment and his mercenary forces. Along with some reinforcements, his numbers totaled to about 20,000 infantry and 500 cavalry. He also incorporated additional siege machines, showing that now he planned to reduce other Thessalian cities. Such a large force showed how vital Thessaly was to his plans, as aside from increasing Phokian military might, a subdued Thessaly could use its voting power, along with that of the Locrians and Dorians, to legally bring the Sacred War to an end. This campaign that pitted Onomarchus' mercenary army against Philip's smaller veteran army is fascinating to think about. However, like many of the finer details of Philip's campaign, the campaign is largely unknown to us, although what details can be gathered tell us of a game of maneuver. Onomarchus kept guiding the Macedonian forces, avoiding Philip's army in an open battle. Eventually, Philip managed to pin down Onomarchus to a valley. The Phokians had placed themselves across the valley on level ground, blocking themselves from flanking. The Macedonians advanced from the mouth of the valley towards the Phokian line. The level ground favoured the phalanx with its smaller sarissas, invulnerable in a frontal assault. Such a sight made the Phokians retreat before the Macedonians out to the Crescent Mountain behind them. With the enemy in the run, the Hypaspes pursued, pushing for a shattering retreat. This, however, had been a ruse, and when the Macedonian phalanxes found themselves out in the open field, the Phokian catapults unleashed fire from above. The ambush devastated the tightly packed formations. following the barrage, hidden troops flanked the Macedonians, and the fleeing enemy turned around, charging at the bewildered Macedonians. Still under punishing artillery fire and assaulted on all sides, Philip's forces managed to rally and make a difficult retreat, but only with heavy losses. Philip salvaged his army and was expelled from Thessaly. Onomarchus had achieved what no one else could claim, that he had defeated Philip II in battle. He won himself victory using a strategy worthy of Alexander the Great, managing to outfox Philip on the battlefield. This crushing defeat shattered the illusion of Philip's forces. For 6 years he had fought pretenders, Illyrians, Paeonians, and Thracians without defeat. Up until now, Macedonia seemed invincible, conquering all in its path with no rest. Onomarchus had ended that winning streak, and this blow to Philip had huge ramifications not only to his military, but to his cunning diplomacy. Yet, characteristically, Philip saved face in defeat and claimed that he did not flee, but just like the rams, I walk backwards in order to ram again all the harder.